UI component, grid. Let's start from model, resource model, and collection classes for the entity. Here is the model file, app, code, unit 2, computer games, model, game.php. This model class extends the abstract model or abstract extensible model class. The construct method will be called when a model is instantiated. Next is the resource model class in app, code, unit 2, computer games, model, resource model, game.php. The resource model is executing SQL queries. Every resource model in Magento extends an abstract class called AbstractDB. This contains the functions for fetching information from the DB. One example is the model class, the resource model class required construct method. This method will call the init function to define the table name and the primary key for that table. Next, the collection class in app, code, unit 2, computer games, model, resource model, game, collection.php. The collection model is considered a resource model, which lets you filter and fetch collection table data. Collection class extends abstract collection and implements search result interface. We need model, resource model, and resource model collection to manage data in the table. And finally, the table to store the entity records needs to be defined in a dbschema.xml file. Also, we need to define the entry in the admin menu that will link to the page with the grid. Add a file, app, code, unit 2, computer games, etc, admin.html, menu.xml. When it's done and the cache has been flushed, the new menu entry should already be visible in the admin menu. Backend route. Two things are required to add a new admin route. First, the route needs to be created. Second, create the action controller. To configure the backend route, add a file, app, code, unit 2, computer games, etc, admin.html, routes.xml. Now we need to create the backend action class that will process the request here. Unit 2, computer games, controller, admin.html, game, index. The admin resource class constant is set to the ACL resource ID specified in the etc acl.xml file. Access to admin accounts in select parts of the admin area can be granted through an ACL, Access Control List. When creating a new page in the admin area, a new ACL resource should be created at the same time. To do this, create the file etc acl.xml with the following contents. The new ACL resource identifier is unit2_computergames::grid. This is only used to display the ACL resource tree in the admin backend at System, Permissions, User Roles. Unit 2, Computer Games, Controller, admin.html, index. The value passed to the setActiveMenu method on the backend page result matches the menu item ID specified in the etc admin.html menu.xml file. The addBreadCrumb method matches breadcrumb, and getTitle method prepends a title on the grid page. Now we can configure a UI component for the page. First, we need to add a layout.xml file. The directory for this file is app, code, unit 2, computer games, view, admin.html, layout. The file name consists of the route ID, the action path, and the action name, separated by underscores. The layout.xml file name has to be games_game_index.xml for this particular case. Now let's consider the UI component configuration file based on the UI component name referenced in the layout XML file. Unit 2, Computer Games, View, Admin HTML, UI_component, computer_games_listing.xml. The UI component XML configuration is rather long and contains numerous internal references, so any names or values have to be matched correctly. The argument tag is in the base of the file. Magento 2 provides the item, passed in data, initiates data source. The provider value has two parts. The first, computer games listing, is the name of the UI component, and the second part, computer games listing data source, is the name of the data source. Right here, as you can see, which uses data on the server and makes the UI component work with this data. Deps sets the dependency on component initialization. In addition to configuring the UI component, a few additional steps need to be taken. First, register the listing data provider collection for the collection source ID. And second, add the columns and action column class. Register the listing data provider collection for the collection source ID. A data source with the name computer_games_listing_data_source is configured in the UI component XML. We need to associate this name with a resource model using di.xml. So, we need a virtual type and type, which allows us to insert this dependency. And right after, we have a type, which will receive it as the dependency. Columns. The columns component is a collection of columns. It renders the table element and displays the records of the listing component in this table. The column component implements a basic column in listing. Let's consider these two in the definition.xml file in the Magento_UI module. Here we can see that the basic columns class is Magento UI component listing columns, and next to it the basic JS component Magento_UI JS grid listing. For column, basic class is Magento UI component listing columns column, and basic JS component is Magento_UI JS grid columns column. So, component is a JS module in Magento that is responsible for the rendering and contains a path to the component's JS file. Let's consider a trial_period column as an example. Each column has a list of settings. With our example, we have options, which has an array of items for the filter. Filter renders UI controls for filtering and applies filtering. Data type is right next to it. On this particular page, it's select, the same as our filter. Label provides a label to the column and filter section, and so on. Sorting is the next column. This is the column's sorting order. It can be ascending, descending, or none. False, in other words. Visible. Initial component's visibility. When set to false, the display none CSS style is added to the component's DOM block. And finally, action column. So, we need to define a class to provide the extensions for the actions column in the grid. The class name is specified as part of the columns definition in the UI component XML, and the matching file is app code unit 2 computer games UI component listing column gameactions.php. Let's consider this class, which should extend the Magento UI component listing columns column as the default class for columns, and should implement the prepareDataSource method with actions such as delete and edit. the delete action for separate items. Each row in the grid offers two actions in the action column, edit and delete. For the delete action, we need to add an additional action controller. App, Code, Unit 2, Computer Games, Controller, Admin HTML, Game, Delete.php. This is a basic backend controller which extends Magento, Backend, App, Action, Class. You need to implement the execute method. And with this code, you are able to delete separate records.